Hi, I'm Michael Midgley, the owner of 6-6 Fitness and Health and the coach and trainer at the Nuts Challenge down in Dorking. I've been asked to do a quick video for you guys coming into Winter Nuts. Personally, I've done 4 laps of Winter Nuts for the last 3 years, so I'm coming from a good place to help you along with your kit suggestions for that. The weather over the last couple of years has been quite brutal, with a very high percentage failure rate as well. Before we start looking at my personal kit choices, it's also worth remembering that what you're actually trying to do whilst you're out there is generate body heat and then maintain that body heat. The more of that heat that you're losing through extremities by not wearing a hat, things like that, then the harder it's going to be to sort of sustain 3 or 4 laps of the course. People get caught out every year just by thinking they can keep moving, they'll generate the heat. The thing to remember is you're not always going to be sort of moving on the course. You're going to be in water quite a lot. You're potentially going to be queuing for some obstacles, particularly on the first lap when everybody's leaving together. So these are all the things that you're then going to start losing the body temperature that you've sort of fought hard to get initially. Obviously, running the training days and spending lots of time on the course with the Team Nuts guys, it's easy to sort of gauge for me what I'm going to need, and I tend to work on the same basic principles of certain bits of kit and then layer up accordingly to that. A lot of people will just throw neoprene on. Personally, I prefer not to and have that as a very, very last resort, or maybe a 4th lap option. I prefer to be able to move more freely, and as you'll see from the choices I have, the layered approach works better for me, as well as some of the individual things like merino wool and things. So we'll start looking through different layering options now, and I'll take you through what I would generally be wearing and have worn for the last 3 years. Okay, so working through the upper body, for me, merino wool is always going to be my very, very, very sort of first layer next to my skin. My preferred choice generally is a DHB sleeveless tank that I use, mainly because that still keeps me a bit more free in the arms. I'm keeping my torso nice and warm, but I've still got freedom to sort of move in other areas. Other options I'll have is maybe an Innovate sort of sleeveless t-shirt, or the Helly Hansen sort of Lifer tops that again are a really good choice, depending on the thickness and how cold it is. Personally, for me, it would be the DHB tank that I would wear first. And that's generally to, obviously there's a lot that's been said of merino wool over the last few years. I know Peter Rees from Mud School did a lot of testing as well early on, and it's a natural fibre, so any body heat that you're generating tends to sort of stay next to your skin as long as you've got close enough layers against you. Okay, so second layer on the upper body for me is a compression type top. I have 2 options that I use for that. First one being my Virus Stay Warm. So I found this to be very good. I did some testing with thermal imaging a couple of years ago against other equipment, and that worked really, really well. Last year I actually found something else that I used on last year's event, which worked good as well, which is the Billabong, and it's their furnace gear. So I found this really good. It's a really tight compression. It's got the usual sort of rubber strip at the bottom to hold it and stop it riding up and everything as well, and that works very well as a next layer for me. So on top of the compression layer, if it's needed, I also have another rash vest that I will use. Again, you notice it's sleeveless, so I'm not restricted in movement on the arms or anything. It's just keeping my trunk nice and warm. So there's an option if it's a cold day. And then obviously on top of that, there's going to be the Team Nuts vest. Okay, so moving on to the lower body. Personally, for me, I prefer not to use compression tights, but for those that do, again, I would recommend the Virus Stay Warm. They were very good. Very, very rarely do I use those, possibly in training occasionally, but for races and for long times, I prefer not to have the sort of like wet material against my legs. I prefer to have my legs free, and so I go for the Mystic shorts, which again, they're not neoprene, but they do have a fleecy type lining, and last year they were brilliant, so I will generally be wearing those. and on top of those just a normal pair of cheap shorts, more for protection than anything else, just to stop you getting through all your good kit too quickly with all the ditches that you're climbing in and out of. So with the main parts of the body covered, we're now looking at your sort of feet, hands and your head, and for me with the feet it's always going to be a pair of merino socks. So merino socks straight on, and then on top of those a pair of neoprene socks. So if you've not used these before, they're very cheap, they're about £7 or £8 on eBay, and they're really good. They do hold the moisture in, but they do keep your feet warm once you're in there. They're quite bulky, so what I tend to do, you generally buy a size up with your shoes anyway, so I found that taking the inner soles out of my trainers gives me enough room to fit these in there. So you're not necessarily going to have to go and get another pair of shoes, you just may have to adapt to not having your insoles in. So with the hands, most people will go out and buy a pair of neoprene gloves, 3mm cheap gloves off eBay. I found these though to be too thick. They do hold an awful lot of moisture, so when you're running around doing multiple laps, you're just keeping cold water against your hands all the time. So I don't use these anymore. What I've actually done is gone for the O'Neill FLX. They're a little bit thinner, they're really good grip on the inside of the palms as well, but just being that little bit thinner, they're really good. And again, I would wear a pair of merino liners under those as well, just for heat properties. So you also find that you're going to pay more for your merino liners than you do your actual gloves, but it is worthwhile, particularly for anyone that's got Reynards out there or anything. I know there's a lot of people that do suffer from it, so even shoving hand warmers down and everything else, it's well worth having a pair of merino liners in there. Okay, then moving on to your head. Again, I don't own a neoprene hat. I've never felt the necessity to get one. For nuts in particular, I found the Virus hats to be very good. They're extremely light, and I must admit, when I first got this through, I thought that isn't going to do anything at all, but it is incredible the heat that keeps in. The one problem you are going to have is the slide though. Obviously you're going to submerge every time you go down the slide, so it's a case of trying to either have multiple hats for different sort of laps of the course. So as you come through transition, change your hat, put a new hat on, put a buff on your head or something, but make sure you keep your head covered at all times to keep that heat in there. So that's the main points covered really. The only other additional thing I would say, personally for me, rather than throwing neoprene on and hoping that that's going to do everything, as it gets to the end of the third, fourth lap, so if it is a really cold day, I think you're better off with a cheap pack of Mac that's going to stop the wind cutting through, it's going to hold some temperature in there. You can also stick your hood up as you're going down the slide for the last couple of times as well if you need to. And for the sake of £4 or £5 from Sports Direct or somewhere like that, it is going to be well worth buying just to be able to bin afterwards. Well, thanks for watching. I hope that's been useful for you, and if I don't see you one of the training weekends before the event, I look forward to seeing you at Winter Nuts. And good luck.